Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Japan spent most of the last 80 years as the textbook case of a pacifist state. A constitution that renounces war, a 1% cap on defense spending, a ban on selling weapons abroad. That picture is now changing fast. Tokyo has built counter-strike missiles, started exporting lethal equipment, and set out to double its defense budget. Today, I am joined by Vanshika Saraf, my colleague from Takshashila Institution, who has just written a paper tracing exactly how this happened and how far it really goes. We talk about what has changed, what hasn't, and why a country can rearm without ever rewriting the rule that says it can't. I'm your host for today, Arindam Goswami. We both are research analysts at the Takshashila Institution. So, Vanshika, welcome. Welcome to this podcast. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Arindam. Thank you.
So, the paper is called Journey of Japan's Defense Transformation. When you use the word transformation, could you expound on what has actually transformed and what has stayed exactly where it was?
Great question to begin with. So, when I say transformation, I'm primarily referring to the changes in the country's capabilities, in the country's thinking, and just a greater willingness to assume more responsibilities related to defense. But what has fundamentally changed, in my belief, is what Japan believes it must be capable of doing. So now, for much of the post-war period, Japan maintained what is essentially a minimum sort of defense posture, right? The SDF was always designed to just protect Japanese territory, while the US provided the larger sort of offensive nuclear deterrent. But today we're seeing that Japan is moving towards a more active model wherein it's trying to acquire long range counter strike capabilities, building larger ammunition reserves, investing in cyber, space, unmanned systems, and overall just strengthening its ability across air, maritime, and land domains. And we see that I'll start with the changes, right? So now there's a permanent sort of joint operations command, which will integrate all the different branches of the self-defense forces. Now going forward, I'll say SDF, just for a paucity of time. And similarly, the alliance with the US, it's becoming more operationally integrated. There are also a lot of economic and diplomatic changes that have taken place. As you mentioned, defense spending has moved beyond the 1% norm that it followed for the longest time. Arms export restrictions have loosened to a large extent. Defense production is now being treated as a very important facet of this rebuilding. And Japan is also providing a lot of official security assistance and equipment to other partners. So these are more or lesser changes. But as you said, there are a lot of things that have not changed, right? Constitutionally, Article 9 has not been formally amended. Overall, Japanese defense posture is still defense oriented. There are still a lot of strict conditions that the use of force has to sort of satisfy. It's still, Japan cannot sort of have an unprovoked sort of preemptive strike. There are non-nuclear principles that remain in place. Civilian control is still very strong. The US alliance continues to be sort of, let's say, the foundation of Japanese security. So I think change has to be understood in terms of, moving from a more, passive attitude where, okay, the US is going to take care of us, and, a more attitude of dependence towards this idea of greater responsibility. So I think that is where the changes have really happened.
Great. Your core finding is that Japan changed its defense posture without changing its constitution. So, how does a country really pull that off, and why did it choose reinterpretation over a clean rewrite of Article 9?
Yeah. So let me start with like sort of what the constitution says, right? So according to Article 9, basically Japan renounces war, and it also says that it will not maintain war potential. But the government also gradually established the position that the constitution cannot deny Japan the inherent right of self-defense, right? And this was the interpretation that provided sort of the legal basis even for the creation of the SDF. in the first place. Now, for several decades, the government had this distinction between individual and collective self defense. But that changed during the Abe government. So first, there was a cabinet decision in 2014, which basically reinterpreted what like the minimum necessary use of force is. And the argument was that look, it's a highly interdependent security environment, and if there is an attack on a very close partner that does threaten Japan's own survival, then the SDF can help and assist allies. So this was where in 2015, basically the idea of collective self-defense was also included, right? But also here it authorized the limited exercise of collective self-defense. So the word limited here is important, right? Because Japan does not claim sort of an unrestricted ability to fight on behalf of allies, right? Force can only be used in certain cases. For example, one, when an attack poses a clear danger to Japan and its people, when there are no appropriate means available, and when the force is used to a minimum necessary extent. So there are a lot of conditions like this baked into the constitution. Now, onto your second part of okay, why was this reinterpretation route sort of selected? So, I mean, first is very procedural because amending the constitution requires a two-third majority in both the houses, and it also then requires a national referendum. So, there's a very high political threshold to sort of amend the constitution. And secondly, it's that this Article 9 or like just in general, all these provisions, they're not just legal sort of, nitty gritties. They've also become a part of Japan's post war national identity. So a lot of citizens, although they support stronger national defense, but they're still very uncomfortable with formally abandoning a constitution that promotes peace. So therefore, revising the constitution would actually sort of invite a larger debate over the history and identity of Japan itself. And I think the third reason was just simply sort of political urgency, right? Because in the last few decades, we've seen China's military rise, we've seen North Korea's missile program expand. So I think the government realized that look, amendment process will take a very long time, and therefore we need a quicker response. So reinterpretation was seen as this sort of political compromise that we can expand what the SDF forces do, but while also being very defense oriented in our approach. So I think that was the thinking.
Right. Now, talking about this, the shift from the 2014 collective self-defense decision to the current build-up program, you have listed out 4 policy changes as the engine of this shift, right? So,
Yeah.
why those 4, and which one mattered the most?
Yeah, so I think these 4, each perform sort of a different function when we see the larger arc of transformation. And there's also a sequence to it, right? So if we see the 2014, there was a cabinet decision, which I would say was like a legal opening, right? Because it allowed the collective self defense idea. But that decision itself did not give the SDF any new operational powers, right? That came later in the 2015 security legislation. Then basically that expanded the circumstances in which Japan could provide logistical support or protect other assets or participate in any international security operations. So those were the things that changed later. Then you have the 2022 National Security Strategy. Now, this was, sort of laid out the grand strategic purpose behind all of this, right? So it identified a much more severe regional threat environment, and therefore it introduced counter strike capability as a central element of deterrence. And also the idea that look, Japan should be able to assume greater responsibility for its own security, along with support from the US, but also a lot more independently. And so basically, there was this idea that, look, we used to ask what is the minimum Japan is allowed to do, to asking, okay, what capabilities do we need to survive a modern conflict? And this is where I think the last document comes in, right? Which is the defense build up program. Now, this is basically sort of, let's say, the document that provides resources for all of that ambition that they've been, laying out before. For example, like how would you actually fund all of these, missile capabilities, strengthening your bases, having stronger command and control structures, all of that. So you need the funding behind it. Otherwise, then the strategy only remains sort of declaratory. So I think in terms of, I think since you asked me which is the most sort of important one, so there are two. I mean, 2014 was foundational, right? Because without it, all those later changes couldn't have been brought about. But I think in terms of like bigger impact, definitely the 2022 national security strategy, because that was when all those, several changes actually were brought together in, and those sort of adjustments became part of this larger strategic framework. So it's like 2014, sort of opened the door to it, but 2022 was like a bigger determinant in what Japan's intentions are and where it wants to go with it.
Right, right. Now, so from ranking the policy changes, now let's move to the question of ranking, say, China, North Korea, and Russia by how much each actually drives Japanese planning. If you were to do that, what would be your order and why?
Yeah, I mean, actually, you said it in in the right. I mean, in the order itself, and you can see that being reflected in sort of official language, because China was always seen as one of the greatest strategic challenges. North Korea is seen as a grave and imminent threat, and again, Russia is seen as sort of a strong security concern. And obviously, China comes first because it's a larger sort of long-term systemic level challenge, right? China affects where Japan is deploying its forces. What is it purchasing? What are the platforms that it's buying? How closely is it integrating with the US? So all of these really impact obviously Japanese planning, and there has to do with historical, let's say, problem of hostilities, whether it was pressure around disputed islands, whether it's the Taiwan Strait, whether it's just it could simply be a Chinese attack on, say, some base, or the a disruption of some maritime route. Then there is also China's gray zone sort of challenge, coast guard incursions, naval activity, and just coercive actions that remain, let's say, below the threshold of a conventional war. Because in that ways, China is a problem across peacetime as well. Then I would say definitely North Korea, because in the last few years, North Korea has really expanded its missile programs, and this has led Japan to invest in its own defense system, early warning systems, surveillance, counter strike, etc. Because it has been demonstrated that look, North Korean missiles can reach Japan, and the more sort of platforms, different sort of platforms they're using, interception becomes all the more difficult. So I think with North Korea, the challenge for Japan is look, you need to detect it in a small time. You need to intercept it and potentially also neutralize any sort of incoming missile threat. And I think last, and what is interesting for me also is Russia as sort of an important country when it comes to Japanese defense thinking. So if you see the northern part of Japan, Russia still sort of maintains a lot of military capabilities around the contested northern territories. There's still sort of nuclear forces around the Sea of Okhotsk, and more importantly, Russia also conducts joint exercises with China. And so sort of this raises the possibility of some sort of coordinated or even maybe simultaneous pressure across both Japan's northern and sort of southwestern theaters. That's one way Russia is directly sort of affects Japan, but I think it also affects Japan, matters to Japan in another way, and this was sort of visible after the invasion of Ukraine, right? Because it showed that a major power can use force to change borders. So I think for Japanese policymakers, what they learned was look, what happened in Europe can also happen in the Indo Pacific. And so, therefore, I think all these three countries do drive Japanese defense planning to a very large extent.
Right, right. Now, having started talking about China, let's double click a bit on it. China's defense budget is several times the size of Japan's. So, is Japan trying to balance China on its own, or is the entire strategy built around never having to do so, right? And is that more of a balance of threat question instead of a balance of power one? Proximity and intent, maybe they seem to matter more than raw numbers here, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, Japan is not trying to balance China in terms of, matching its spending or, its fleet size, etc. It knows it cannot realistically win an arms race with China. So, as you said, part of the strategy is, around avoiding that requirement at all. So, I think something that Japan is trying to do is, deny China maybe sort of some easy, very quick sort of success in the areas that are very close to Japan, right? Especially around the East China Sea and the southwestern islands. So I think the objective is, to increase, to make the local costs and the risks and the uncertainties of using force extremely high for China. And I think this is where also the US alliance is important, right? Because the US contributes a lot of capabilities that Japan cannot and then also does not intend to, reproduce independently, which is, nuclear deterrence, intelligence sharing, long range power production, reinforcement capacity. All of this the US brings to the table. So I think for Japan, what it mostly expects and wants to do is, protect its own bases, maintain access, and also create sort of, favorable conditions in which even the US can sort of operate effectively. So I think what you said is important, right? More than balance of power, it's a balance of threat distinction. And it's not just about, responding to China's aggregate power, but how close it is, the proximity, China's own expanding, offensive capabilities, its sort of persistent naval activity around Japan. So yeah, intentions matter. And a lot of Japanese planning is obviously not only shaped by what, China is very clearly saying, but also what its own growing capabilities would allow it to do, right? So the idea is to balance China, but within the US alliance, which is you build enough sort of local denial and resilience capacity to prevent China from, creating a lot of disruption in the region, while broadly the US would still take care of, the broader nuclear and conventional balance.
Okay, so now having discussed about China, let's also move to the other elephant in the room, the US, right? So the US is upgrading its forces in Japan, but the Pentagon reportedly considered scrapping that for cost reasons. This is the old alliance problem of fearing abandonment on one side and entrapment on the other, right? So which way does Japan worry more, and how does this relationship pan out?
Yeah, see, I think definitely Japan worries more about abandonment. Though we have to qualify that, look, abandonment not in any dramatic sense of, US withdrawing all its troops or sort of terminating the treaty, but in the sense that, look, the US has been hesitating for a while. It could respond very slowly, or it could decide that, look, defending this particular Japanese interest is not worth it. So, those concerns are what Japan worries about more. And similarly, we've seen the US in the last 4 years asking its own allies for, increased burden sharing. So there is anxiety about, whether an American president would accept the, risk of escalation against, say, a China or a North Korea in order to sort of defend Japan. And especially when it comes to using, nuclear arms. So I think this is why Japan has, repeatedly also tried to seek explicit sort of reassurances. Now that what you mentioned, that Pentagon discussion about canceling some sort of upgrade to the forces, it did ultimately go through. The proposal was continued, but there was then this hesitation, and it suggested that, look, there could be any economic cost cutting exercise that then could have an impact on the alliance. And so it illustrated that, look, there is a difference in formal commitments and also, but the confidence in how consistently those commitments will be implemented. So there is that. But on the question of entrapment, it is a concern in the sense that Japan does not want to be, drawn automatically into any sort of, say, a war between US and China over Taiwan or any other, American military operation in some other part of the world, simply because, there are US forces in the Japanese territory. And also, there's great integration between both, right? There is command integration, intelligence sharing, there is long range strike coordination. So all this does in a certain way reduces the possibility of America just abandoning its own responsibility, but it also makes it a little hard for Japan to remain insulated. But having said that, Japan does manage this risk of being entrapped using its own sort of legal and political controls, right? So if you see that 2015 legislation that we discussed, it does not give US any right to order Japanese forces into combat. The government still has to determine whether a situation satisfies all of those constitutional conditions around the use of force. So I think for Japan, it fears both, but abandonment is sort of the greater anxiety. And that abandonment can be, in terms of, let's say, reduction of US forces placed in Japan. It can be like very broad strategic abandonment where there is retrenchment from the entire Indo-Pacific theater when the US decides, okay, Indo-Pacific is not important for us anymore. Or it can be, operational in terms of like delay during a certain contingency. Or as we've seen, it can also be political, wherein you sort of make alliance commitments conditional on okay payment, on some sort of trade concession, etc. So I think this is the problem that Japan is more worried more than entrapment for sure.
Right, right. So Japan just lifted its ban on exporting lethal weapons. For a country that built part of its identity on not selling arms, how big a break is this? And who is it really aimed at?
Right. So yeah, for much of the post-war era, not exporting weapons was part of Japan's identity as a peaceful state. So defense production did exist, but it was largely insulated from international arms market. And in general, arms exports was treated as something that could implicate Japan in the conflict of other countries. Now there's a new approach, right? Now Japan is arguing that look, we can supply defense equipment to trusted partners, and this can actually prevent conflict by strengthening deterrence and creating a more favorable security environment around Japan. So basically, arms transfers is no longer being seen as a risk to Japan's identity. It's actually being seen as a contribution to peace, if anything, right? But again, it's important not to overstate this change, because despite the recent legal change, Japan has not created an unrestricted sort of global arms market. Every transfer will still be examined individually. Recipient governments will face end use third party transfer controls. There'll be export to countries that are involved in active conflicts will remain restricted. So in that sense, there are a lot of guardrails around this. Now, the second part of who is it aimed at, I think in some ways in three, let's say, levels. So strategically, it's obviously aimed at trying to deter China. So for example, Philippines, Japan is providing more ships and radar and other sort of capabilities to Manila, because Philippines faces sustained Chinese pressure around its own islands, and therefore this is one level. Secondly, also Japan's broader network of allies and like-minded partners. It's also aimed at that, right? Not only US, but Australia, European partners like Poland, maybe. So Japan wants to participate in, joint development. It's realized that there is a shortage currently created by rising global demand for, weapons and ammunition. So yeah, as much as it is about sort of selling, Japanese made stuff, it is also about being embedded in defense supply chains of allies. And finally, it's the economy. Economically, Japan's own defense industry, there's a need for its revival. And for the longest time, Japanese companies were producing for very small sort of domestic consumer base. So unit costs are very high. There are still limited incentives to invest in sort of additional factories. So I think the idea of moving towards export, it can increase basic production volumes. It can also sort of create buffers in case of its a prolonged crisis. So there are multiple aims sort of with this focus.
Right. And one way of looking at this is that they're probably treating the defense industry as a growth asset, right? And that's one way of looking at how Synonomics is probably treating this. So, is that a genuine economic bet, or mostly a way to sell rising defense spending to a public that's become wary of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's a little bit of both, right? One, there is a very genuine economic and industrial logic behind treating defense as this growth asset. Like I was mentioning, the defense industry has suffered from a lot of problems because the low profit margins, there have always been a lot of restrictions. So companies have either withdrawn from this sector because it's just commercially very unattractive, because you have to maintain very highly specialized, production lines, etc. But now the government is trying to reverse that decline, right? It's trying to say that, look, you can get larger, more predictable orders, you can have multi year contracts, you can do joint development with other partners. And this will, I think, will have obviously a lot of economic benefits. And Japan, especially, it remains quite strong in capabilities like, shipbuilding, aerospace, sensors, precision manufacturing. All these are, strengths in Japan anyway. So the fact that it can now start, exporting in certain sectors will, create demand, will sort of preserve some sort of high skilled employment. It will support even, technologies with civilian applications. So I think exports and joint production will also give these Japanese firms some sort of economies of scale that they have historically lacked. But like you said, there is also, a very clear political function to this framing, because if the government describes defense as investment, it allows the government to move the debate away from that, the guns versus butter question. So telling the public that, look, social spending is important, but we also need to invest in the military because this will create jobs, it will strengthen our own manufacturing base, it will generate innovation and, economic security and all those words that the government likes to use. So it is important, it is useful, especially in Japan, where military expansion remains a very politically sensitive thing, where there is already a lot of rising social security expenditure, putting pressure on public finances. But I would say that between this, the security requirement, came first. It's not like Japan identified defense as this growth sector and therefore we need to now produce arms. It was seen that, look, we need to, rearm anyway, that is strategically necessary, but we can get economic returns from this. So I would say that defense can become sort of this valuable niche, an anchor for strategic manufacturing. By itself, there are still limits to how much it can grow, but it is a useful framing to help the public buy the idea.
Right. And in your paper, you have listed a few constraints that could likely slow down the whole project, right? So, and these could be very easy to underrate also: an aging population, recruitment shortages, and the highest public debt in the developed world, right? So, could you maybe firstly go through these constraints a little bit, and then which of these do you think is the most likely to slow down the whole project?
Yeah, I mean, look, these problems are sort of well known, at this point, and I would say, I mean, the first and the third are intrinsically related, which is, having an aging population and therefore having, recruitment shortages. Now, there is only so many problems you can throw money at. You can buy expensive stuff, but you cannot, overnight produce, trained engineers, pilots, maintenance crews at the same speed. So the recruitment, I think, is a big constraint, because SDF is already below sort of their authorized strength. Entry level personnel recruitment has fallen down, and at the same time, right, Japan is asking its force to do more. Like, there is more need for constant maritime and air surveillance, expanding cyber and space units, and deepening joint operations with the US. All of this you're making your forces do, but at the same time you don't have enough people to do it with. And it's not just any people. You need extremely specialized skills, right, for the military. You need experts, engineers, technicians, you need digital talent, all of that. So I think the aging population is definitely a big problem, because it also ultimately then that would also raise social security spending. So there are obviously some arguments that, look, the more automation and more unmanned systems you use, that can sort of reduce manpower requirements, but they still do not remove them, right? Even no matter how many drones you have, you still require operators. You still require logistical support, you still require teams for communication networks. So I would say that is a big problem, and I think obviously then comes public debt, which I would rank third in terms of the effect, because we've seen so far that, look, Japan can politically prioritize defense spending despite all of its high debt to GDP ratio, despite its defense burden. So it has been able to increase its defense budget. But now the next challenge is, how long can you maintain that? Maintaining that level beyond this sort of current build up period will become harder, right? Because then your costs of your pensions, your healthcare, your other social obligations will continue increasing, and then you're competing for the same resources. So I think these constraints are extremely real and something that Japan itself is trying to grapple with.
Right. Now stepping back a bit and maybe zooming out a bit, I wanted to discuss one aspect. You have been very careful to say that this is not a remilitarization, right? So where exactly is this line, and what would have to happen for you to drop this conclusion?
Right. See, I think so. This word remilitarization, right, is very politically charged. If you read a lot of these Chinese documents right now, they're all saying that, look, Japan is remilitarizing. But it's not just look like how much money they are spending or like whether Japan has more weapons now than it did 10 years ago. I think for me, the distinction is look, what is the political purpose and what are the legal limits of these new capabilities? There is clearly an expansion in its military capabilities, but remilitarization is a very strong word, right? Because that would imply that Japan is trying to become this expansionist power, that has designs of territorial expansion or some open ended overseas intervention or just, open ended coercion. Japan is not doing any of that, right? It remains very constrained in terms of what the constitution allows, in terms of the legal limits, in terms of how even like counter strike capabilities are justified. So Japan is not, and it's also still extremely embedded in the US alliance, right? So the aim for Japan is not to establish some sort of, military predominance across Asia. And we have to be very mindful of, the history of war here. And so I would say that, like your question, right? What would need to happen for it to be remilitarizing? I think that would happen if Japan is, I don't know, removing constraints around its own nuclear deterrent, if it's abandoning all of its basic principles, if it's trying to develop its own nuclear arsenal, if it's in fact weakening civilian and parliamentary control over the use of force. Those are things that then would be alarming, but it's not doing any of that. There is still very strong civilian and democratic control over the military. This SDF, in fact, has no independent sort of political role. Every action requires authorization. Public opinion plays a very big role in everything that happens there. So there is definitely sort of, let's say, acquisition of greater capabilities, but it's not remilitarization. I would say it's a greater move towards normalization of military sort of equipment and use, but we still have to be very very cognizant of all the political, institutional, and economic realities that still constrain Japan.
And continuing this in the same vein, and since we've not talked about Taiwan, just wanted to hear your views on Taiwan a bit here. So the Prime Minister, I guess, said a war over Taiwan could threaten Japan's survival, right? And you explained that this phrase is legally loaded. So what does saying it loud actually commit Japan to?
See, I mean, what she said is sort of misappropriated. It was, there was a question in the parliament on certain things, and her answer was actually far more diplomatic than it has been, you know, uh, the way it has been sort of, let's say, put together. But in terms of legality, it's a classification that basically, as I explained, it permits the SDF to exercise the right of collective self-defense to assist an ally under attack. Right, this is the basic idea, and this has always existed. And we also need to understand that how Japan treats Taiwan as a security that's inseparable from Japan's own security. And the biggest connection is geography, right? If you see, Japan's westernmost island, Yunaguni, is not very far from Taiwan, little about 100 kilometers. And in 2022, Chinese ballistic missiles actually landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone. And this was the time that, Japan realized that, look, any Taiwan contingency would not be distant. It could even affect Japanese nationals, because these are inhabited islands, right? And of course, beyond all of these, kinetic dangers, there is also the danger that, look, seizure of Taiwan would decisively alter the balance of US-China balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, right? So a Chinese move on Taiwan carries a very high probability of drawing US into the direct conflict with Beijing, which would inevitably sort of trigger mutual defense commitments. So which is why, this comment by Takaichi was, seen by at least China as, as something that's, a break from the past. And it's also reacted very aggressively in return. But yeah, we need to be careful of, political statements that are sort of blown out of proportion.
Right. Thanks, Mochika, for this very comprehensive discussion. I'm sure our listeners would also enjoy this. As a parting thought, would just like to hear what is the one thing that you'll be watching out for in this context, right? So December 2026 brings the next big strategic review, right? So any parting thoughts on what you will be watching out for?
Yeah, I mean, so for now, what's planned is that the government is going to revise again its national security and sort of defense strategies. Especially, I think something that we need to be on the lookout for is the Japanese defense industrial strategy. I think we discussed it a bit, and we've seen a lot of changes happening in the last few months. So I think the scope of future defense exports is something we need to look out for. I think Japan has already signed this sort of deal with Australia, where it would sort of build a certain class of frigates for Australia. So I think that is something that's going to be exciting. Second is, whether this 2% of GDP spending can be pushed even further. Because that would require a lot of, also approval from the public. And yeah, I think these are some of the things that I would keep a lookout for.
Right. And anything in this for India? I guess I'm sure India is also reading all this very closely. Any lessons for here for India? Anything to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, if we see, so India is a very close partner of Japan, and these recent rules wherein Japan can sell a lot more equipment, India is one of those partners. So I think that in terms of a policy change that clearly gives a direction for India to engage more with Japan and especially do greater sort of joint production of defense equipment. So I think, yeah, for India and Japan, there are lots of areas where it can work together. I think there's a certain radar technology that we've already sort of, spoken of, discussed working together on. So all of these policy changes, I think, are good. It's good news for India, because having a stronger Japan definitely helps having, a stronger, let's say, Indo-Pacific in terms of, balance of power again, and especially when it comes to dealing with China. So I think overall, for India, this is great news. We need to be cautious of things like nuclear forces, and if it tries to Japan tries to rearm in terms of nuclear arms. But I think apart from that, it's good news for India.
Great. Thanks, Vanshika, for sharing your views. And I'll also exhort our listeners to read your paper, which will be linked in the show notes. So yeah, thanks, Vanshika, for joining us. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.